So this topic we have today uh, is I'm going to discuss about the India's banking crisis, ongoing banking crisis, and India's ongoing banking crisis. So uh, wait a second. Yeah, is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Okay. So before we begin, just a quick word because Ahmedabad University is still a new university. Those of you who logged in and heard what Chintan had to share. We are 10-year-old university, uh, and we've been experimenting with our education. And those of you who have seen the India education policy recently, we have been there's a lot of stress on interdisciplinary education, and we couldn't be prouder because for some time we've been stressing on uh, the core value of Ahmedabad University is interdisciplinary education, and so whichever programs we do, and specifically the economics programs, since I'm the chair of the MA economics program, and some of my colleagues who have joined here, so the idea here is that uh, we offer a unique opportunity to study and apply economics in an interdisciplinary setting, and all our programs. The idea is that the world today is shaping into a very different time horizon, and it's very similar to the 1920s, 1930s, where the world was grappling with the pandemic, the First World War, and several other challenges, and education was shaping up. And similarly, we are seeing very similar challenges today with several ongoing challenges. Just before the pandemic, we had challenges of climate change and other things. So what you really need today is interdisciplinary setting where there are team members of different kinds who are working together to understand, and similarly, you need to study economics in an interdisciplinary setting. As a MA program chair, I can just say that our program it lays strong foundations in economics and builds on four pillars of finance, data analytics, technology, and industry. Uh, we are offering two specializations. One is obviously a general MA economics, and another is MA in economics with specialization in finance, where you take finance uh, electives. And the sort of key idea in Ahmedabad University is that our MA program is housed in the is housed in the management school, and so as a result, you can take courses in finance and so on and so forth, which is not really available in other MA programs. And we are apart from we are targeting our program. Our students can work in government policy, central banks, international organizations, think tanks, industrial sector, financial sector, and academic institutions. And Mr. Samir has joined us, who's looking at the MA program. In case you are interested in our MA program and our BA program, you can look up our website. And for MA program, you can either write to me or to Mr. Samir, and we'll be happy to help. So what's the purpose of this summer webinar series? So the idea is to generate some students' interest and discussion in topical economic issues, learn about applying different economic tools and approaches to today's problems, and obviously create some fun and excitement in these testing times. As faculty members, we love speaking to students, and with an online sort of a thing, it gives us an opportunity to reach out to young students and talk to them and understand and also shape our research and so on and so forth. So after today's banking talk, we plan to hold sessions on other topics. Like on next week, we have Professor Puneet Arora, who is going to be applying experimental and behavioral economics to improve India's education system. And then we have Professor Pallavi Vyas, who is going to be speaking on violence against women and public policy. So let's come to the topic of today, which is India's banking crisis. So just as a student of banking history, I must point out that though we are going to focus on today's banking crisis, India has a long history of banking crisis, and interested students can either write to me or they can read my columns in Mint and Bloomberg Quint. Uh, in this lecture, we discuss India's recent ongoing banking crisis. We are not discussing crisis in cooperative banks, NBFCs, housing finance companies, but I'm happy to talk later, either after the seminar or after the seminar, about the interlinkages. And I've also written extensively on the topic, and interested students can go through go through these forums, go through these websites to understand my views. And the big question is, why focus on banking crisis? So some quick points here. In India, banks provide majority of funds compared to capital markets, which is very different compared to United States and some of these other Asian markets where there is much more reliance on capital markets. But as far as India is concerned, banks are the major providers of funds. Interestingly, banking crisis hinders monetary transmission. So if your banks are undercapitalized, banks are going through a crisis, then whatever central banks or in our case RBI does is not really passed on to the consumers and to the industry. And for a long time, this has been a major concern that whatever rate cuts RBI has done, that's not really passed on to consumers. So those of you who read newspapers, you'll all very often read about the bank's inability to transfer the rate cuts of Reserve Bank in the last couple of years to the end consumer and the end industry. Then there are other problems, and we'll discuss this in the presentation. That in India we have a typical problem of having very large public sector banks, which create other kinds of problems, as vividly discussed by former RBI Deputy Governor Viral Acharya. Those of you interested in banking should definitely buy Viral's book to get a synthesis of his ideas. Then, as an economics person, we are interested in banking because finally banking crisis impacts and slows down economic growth. And this has been, there has been a lot of attention on this, especially after the 2008 crisis, where at least when we used to do macroeconomics, there was hardly any mention of finance and banking linkages. Macroeconomics was taught just like a standard GDP inflation sort of a thing. And then we had this course on money and banking, but there was hardly any linkage of money and banking to macroeconomics. But in today's world, there is, after the 2008 crisis, there's a big focus on macroeconomics and finance banking linkages. And I'll discuss some of these things as we move on. So the reason why we focus on banking is not because just that banks are in a problem, but banking sector has a very unique feature that if banks go down, they take the economy down with them. It's not so much the case with other sectors like power, telecom. There, any crisis there, the firms can close down. But in a bank kind of a thing, even whether you are a government-owned, you're a private-owned bank, it's difficult to. And we've seen this in the US, where most of the banks were private sector banks, but the RBI, the Federal Reserve and the other entities got together to save those private sector banks. Okay, so how do we start? How do we start about today's crisis? And it's very interesting that typically all these crises, the seeds are sowed way back. It's not as if something that you gave a loan today and tomorrow there's a problem. And typically the way this Indian banking crisis is shaping up, it obviously has much longer roots. So 2003-08, most of you would rather be in school or very young children at that time. But 2003-08 is when India's GDP growth suddenly goes up in high gear, and there is a lot of reason why it goes up. That if you see this graph here, our growth rates suddenly touch 8 to 9%, and this is seen as India's golden phase. Even globally, growth rates are fairly high in most of the countries, and this phase is generally called as a great moderation phase, where growth rates are high, inflation. Hello. Can you mute? There is some disturbance. Or yeah, is it okay?
Yes, Amol. Yes, it's okay.
Okay.
Amol, just a little louder. Your voice is breaking at times.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think there is, there's been some disturbance because of the cyclone, and there has been some bad weather and all that. Yeah. Okay.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
So typically in 2003-08, the GDP growth, moves to high gear, and as a result, the bank credit numbers also, rates of bank credit also begins to go up. So if you see the long-term average since the 1970s, the long-term credit growth average, and we can always come up with better filters and all that, is about 17%, and is about 17% here. So typically in this phase, the growth rate of credit touches to about 34, 35%. which is seen as a fairly high number given how the credit growth has been for a long time. And around the 2002-3 phase, Dr. Rakesh Mohan, the RBI deputy governor, is basically saying that Indian banking is lazy banking. We are not really growing very fast, and in very few years, we quickly become like a crazy banking with the kind of growth rates which are generated here. Okay, so. And obviously, at that time, there was a lot of discussion going on about the Indian growth story, and everybody was very happy about the generating high growth rate, UPA one phase, and there is a general rejoice. But then, with every good story comes a bad one. And 2008, we have a global crisis, and we suddenly see that the GDP growth suddenly contracts because of the crisis, and even the credit growth numbers begin to fall. But then what really happens is that the economy and both the economy growth and credit growth recovers very quickly. We almost have a V-shaped recovery after the crisis. And there were similar sort of things as we saw in the first wave, second wave right now, that India is immune to the crisis, similar to today's pandemic. 2012-14, growth slows due to several policy issues. It's very interesting that, again, we can compare, though the comparisons are not really one can't really make because this is an apple and orange issue. But even after we recovered from the first wave, there were general suggestions that India is immune. But then we have got a very nasty second wave, and similarly, we got a fairly nasty surprise. And because of several policy issues, the credit growth rate also follows, and it begins to falter and has remained so ever since. And this period of India is typically very interestingly put by Pooja Mehra, another economics student. And now Pooja is a freelance journalist, and she's written this book, India's Lost Decade, in which she kind of sums up what really goes wrong. When I'm talking about several policy issues, there are several of those which are discussed in Pooja's book, and I don't really want to focus there. So 2014 onwards, India's banking crisis comes to the fore. We start to see higher NPA numbers, but those NPA numbers are not as high, and some fallout was expected because we've had a fairly long period of high credit growth. So, but 2015, we have something called an asset quality review. Now, in an asset quality review, what happens is that you take a more you take a more rigorous assessment of the non-performing assets picture, and we'll see what that is. And so suddenly your NPAs, which were hovering at around 5 to 6%, went up to 14%, 15% sort of levels. And suddenly Indian banking system looked very, very shaky. Suddenly there were several questions and several problems which came to the fore, because we really didn't have such a large slowdown, nor we had such a big economic crisis or something that we should see such a large banking fallout, but we ended up seeing that. So we need to really stop here for a while and understand that as economic student, can we build a framework? Do we have some theory? Do we have an economist's work where we can make sense of this? And interestingly, there's Hyman Minsky, whose work was forgotten and was renewed during the 2008 crisis. And I use Minsky's sort of broad framework to understand the Indian banking problem. So Minsky has this thing called financial instability hypothesis, where he says that there are three stages of financing. That typically your economic growth starts, banks give more loans, economy booms, expected growth rate rises, and similarly your credit growth goes up. And then it's very interesting that from this stage is called hedge financing, where most of the financing is happening for proper risk management purposes. But then in all this euphoria, banks become irresponsible, all kinds of loans are given. So we move from hedge financing to speculative financing, and very quickly to Ponzi financing. Ponzi is the name of the famous Ponzi schemes which run where you are simply passing off the buck. And then gradually what happens is that the share of loans to responsible loans becomes larger. And then you have this thing called Minsky moment, which is the day of the reckoning. Something unravels. So typically, if you look at the 2008 crisis, something, all the subprime, which was a very small market, started the trigger, and then gradually the whole thing started to unravel. And similarly, in India, we see all these policy problems, which started in 2012-14, and the AQR and other things which lead to this Minsky moment, coming to from a fairly comfortable banking position, we come to a very difficult banking position. And then there is this feedback mechanism between growth and finance, and the expected growth declines, bank growth falters, there's rise in NPS, and the growth story collapses. So there are these interactions which are happening between finance and economics. And before 2008, we never really studied finance and macroeconomics very closely together. And 2008, we have started to look at the linkages between finance and macroeconomics very closely. And in this regard, Hyman Minsky's work becomes very interesting, because what Minsky is saying is that typically your growth years are the years where there are all these speculative financing and Ponzi financing things taking shape, and it's the job of the regulator and the supervisor to pay more attention to what's happening here. But then, since we are all humans, regulatory bodies are humans, so we do make those mistakes, and those mistakes are very common. As a result, there is this common phrase in banking that each time somebody says that this time is different, it's not really different. We constantly see, and there is another quote by Mark Twain, who says that history never repeats itself, but it rhymes, and we see that a lot in banking and finance. Okay, so Minsky in cartoons, this is a very interesting thing, that we move very quickly from a sell position to a buy position, and a buy position to a sell position, and so on and so forth. So how do we link India's Minsky? How do we connect this to India's Minsky moment? And as I've said, that the GDP growth and the credit growth rates were the credit growth rates are very high, and then they have declined. And when you sort of parallelly look at the NPA numbers, you almost see the parallel mountain peaks. So the yellow line, or the orangish line, being the credit growth rate, and the NPA is the red herring. And here you see that the peak of credit, which comes up 2006-7, 2007-8, and we get the final NPA higher numbers in 2017-18 post the AQR, but the NPAs are going up after 2014-15. So there is genuinely a gap of almost 10 years or so for you to realize the excesses in banking. So the 2008 US crisis, the seeds were the 2000s, and that's the amount of time, and that's the reason why it's very frustrating, and one doesn't know that what should you do here, that so that you can avoid.
Bread pizza.
Kavita, can you mute yourself? Thanks. Okay. So how do we see this? We now get a lot of data from the RBI, and that's also something which I want to alert the students here joining in, that please keep visiting the RBI's website. It's got a lot of data, and familiarize yourself. In fact, so much so that you can study and understand Indian banking largely from RBI website alone. So when we break this credit, saying that, okay, how do we understand it? And typically we understand GDP also in terms of agri-industry services. So we get the GDP, we get the credit numbers also across agri-industry services and personal loans. And again, we see that the share of loans going to the industry from about 30% to about 48%, and then begins to decline. And not very surprisingly, this is where the Minsky, the large number of loans were given to the industrial sector. And as a result, you see the highest amount of NPAs also in the industrial sector. All right. So it's not very surprising that what would be surprising is that let's say if the blue line, which is the services line, or the green line, which is the agri lines, if there were larger NPAs in this compared to industry, but that's not the case. Right now, Minsky's framework is pretty much working. And it's interesting that all this while, as banks are cutting down the share of industry, they are very heavily betting on personal loans. And so far, the personal loan NPAs are fairly low, because people like you and me, we are not big defaulters. But the US subprime market, or US housing problem, also started with the personal loan. So we have to wait and watch where this goes. Okay, so far we are looking at this aggregate picture, but usually when we look at the newspapers, when we see all these names like public sector banks, private banks, and foreign banks, and this is where this is what we read, that India's public sector banks are in trouble, or private sector banks are not doing badly, and so on and so forth. So Indian banking system is basically three parts to it: public sector banks, which are still the largest. So does anybody know why do we get the name public sector banks? Any students here?
Hello, sir.
Yeah. Hi, Jaya.
Sir, this is hello, sir. This is called public sector banks because more than
Jaya, could you introduce yourself?
sir, my name is Jayalakshmi.
Are
Hello.
you a student at?
No, sir, I am not a student. I'm not
Okay,
a student, but just
Okay.
wanted to say that public sector banks are called public sector because more than 60% of their shareholding is owned by the government.
No, fair enough. But where did they come from? How do we get public sector banks in India? Where did they come from?
They're financed by the taxes that we pay.
I think the answer would be that when the nationalization happened in, like, I think
Right.
1970s, 80s, then those private sector
1969.
banks, 1969, yeah, probably. So then
Yeah.
that is where how the public sector banks came into being.
Right. Absolutely right, Mudit. So
Yes, sir.
essentially, 1969 is when Indira Gandhi nationalized 14 of the largest private banks and made them public sector banks. And then we had another round in 1980. So overall, we had 20 public sector banks, and those 20 public sector banks, obviously that share has come down. We'll discuss that. The share at the time of 91 reforms was about almost 92%. That has come down gradually to 65%. And chunk of the decline has been taken up by new private sector banks. So why do we classify new private sector banks and old private sector banks differently? Why don't we call them private sector banks? Any Mudit or anybody else?
Well, technically,
Why do
these are
we
not.
have this?
Well,
These are not.
well, technically, these are not like old private sector banks. These are like regional banks. Like I think, in South India, these are like regional community banks. I would say, like particular to some
Right.
religion or caste or something like that. But
Right.
yeah, I mean, and they cater to very specific region. Like you have a Catholic Syrian bank and all those sorts, which are very particular to a community in Kerala or Tamil Nadu. I'm not sure which region, but
Right.
and over the years they have got listed with a very small floating share, very small in retail share. Most of it is still owned by what do you say?
So maybe the
Yes.
license.
So you are. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe the license must be issued with the condition that they would improve the overall reach of the banking system to the rural areas, considering that the license would be issued to the newer banks. Maybe.
No. Actually, we are confusing a few things here. So essentially, the public sector banks, as some of you said, basically nationalized banks. These were private entities which became public sector banks. So post 91, we licensed some additional private banks like Yes Bank, ICICI, Axis Bank. And so they became the new private sector banks. And the old private sector banks are the ones which remain private, and they were not really nationalized. So as a result, we have these two kind of categories. And the real difference really here is not in terms of licensing or anything. That it's post 91 privatization and before 94, basically, banks which remained. So they were classified. And obviously these, as Mohit argued, that they are community banks and so on and so forth. And as a result, they have a distinct structure, but they're still private banks at the end of the day. And then you have these foreign banks. All right. So, and we have problems in both the public sector banks and private sector banks, and not so much in foreign banks as of now. And most of the foreign banks in India are fairly small. So we have something like 50 odd foreign banks holding about 3% stake. And most of these foreign banks have, just a subsidiary branch or something like that to facilitate loans from their countries, not really doing any worthwhile lending activity or borrowing activity in India. Okay, so now we want to see how did the trouble start in these different bank groups. Okay, so public sector banks, again the same story, 2003-13. So apart from this growth, what really happened is that we saw some gross misgovernance in public sector banks. There were episodes of phone banking that somebody from finance ministry can call you and facilitate those loans. Loans were given to all kinds of companies, and a very important point here is that we had these development financial institutions. What are the development financial institutions? Anybody here? Anybody here?
Sir, institutions that were given to finance large infrastructure projects.
Yeah, but can you put a name to those development financial institutions? India, which were those DFIs?
IDBI was one of them, I believe.
Right, right.
Then
So IDBI, ICICI,
ICICI,
Yes.
NABARD.
IFCI, NABARD. Not NABARD is a DFI of a different kind, but it was not really converted
Largely
into
a regulatory institution.
So typically what really happened is that all these infrastructure and in industry which requires long-term loans, power and all of that, all of those loans were coming from DFIs, and major DFIs like ICICI, IFCI, IDBI, and then later IDFC, they converted themselves into commercial banks. So there's this whole space which is absent, and then the political forces are trying to figure out who is going to lend to infrastructure. Infrastructure is always this big thing before every budget and so on and so forth. And this burden came on, unfortunately, on public sector banks. And the banking problem is that your liabilities are of a very short-term duration, really just 1 to 3 years. All these time deposits and so on and so forth. But if you end up giving loans for 10 years plus or 20 years plus, it becomes a bigger problem. All right. So all this burden of infrastructure loans and real estate, et cetera, which was in housing finance and other institutions, it begins to come on public sector banks. 2014, bank troubles begin in public sector banks. Again, the same thing. We see rise in NPAs and frauds. By 2018, 11 public sector banks under prompt corrective action framework. So obviously, something dramatic has gone wrong in this whole period. And when we break this data of growth in credit with growth in credit in public sector banks and private banks, you can see that for most of this period, private banks usually have higher growth rates. There is a typical period of 2009, 10, 8, typically when the crisis happened, where the growth rate in public sector banks is much higher. And there is a fair bit of research which argues that the loans given during this period are the ones which are leading to NPAs in public sector banks. So, and it's very intriguing that, and very depressing also, that in 2018-19 total NPAs of around 9.3 lakh crores, public sector banks constitute about 80% of this sort of a thing. And then when you look at frauds, you see that the share of frauds of public sector banks, which were basically started by Indira Gandhi you nationalize these banks because there were claims by the industrialists and some other people that private sector banks are engaging in fraud. So you nationalize them so that they don't engage in frauds. And today we've come to a stage where public sector banks are contributing most of those frauds. And within those frauds, most of those frauds are in advances. And it's obviously, you can link this chain together, saying that, okay, public sector banks are the ones which were giving all these infrastructure loans. And in that process, there's some fraud for all these problems. And it's not very surprising when you look at all the infrastructure companies today, like for instance, the 12 largest borrowers which owe these banks, most of them are infrastructure companies or hidden as infrastructure companies or something like that, right? So big, large companies which have taken these loans and are unable to pay them, whether it's Reliance or whether it is those Jindal companies and some of those steel, textiles, and so on and so forth. And if you see, this was a question which Chintan was raising, that how things have really deteriorated. That return on assets on public sector banks has come down sharply, and you see all this while they were competing fairly okay with new private banks, and suddenly the difference between the two has increased sharply. capital adequacy ratio is not caught up. The government, as some of you argued, that it's basically the government which infuses capital in these banks. And this period is also marked by a period of high fiscal deficits, a period of profligacy and all kinds of problems. And in that process, the government is not being able to capitalize the public sector banks as much as it would have liked. And all this while, again, in this period, your public sector banks are fairly well capitalized compared to private sector banks. But since then, it has deteriorated, though one can also say that the share of the private sector banks have also, the levels are fairly high, but they have also not managed to. So there is a particular period of Indian banking, and that's the reason we are discussing this topic today. So what's happening in private banks? So public sector banks, we'll discuss what those reasons are. I'll just give you an overview first, and then we look at the reasons. So 2003-15 private banks are doing fine. 2015 onwards, we see a loan scam with their CEO getting involved in a very tiny amount, but anyways, it's a scam. A scam is a scam. Axis Bank was seen as hiding NPAs. Yes Bank, plus Lakshmi Vilas Bank I'll discuss. So Yes Bank is a new private sector bank. Lakshmi Vilas Bank is an old private sector bank, and we'll see what really happened in this bank. And again, here Minsky comes to the rescue. So 2004, the bank started by Rana Kapoor and Ashok Kapoor. In the same period, Kotak Mahindra Bank was also licensed. And when you look at the growth rates of Yes Bank, and this is indexed 2005 to 100, and when you see Yes Bank compared to other Kotak Bank or HDFC Bank and all other private banks, they don't even show here. And whereas Yes Bank has typically zoomed. And in a period, what is interesting is that this is a period where Indian banking is kind of really declining, right? You're seeing growth rates collapsing, and whereas Yes Bank's balance sheet is expanding. So what is it that Yes Bank is doing that it is leading to these high numbers? Obviously, when the overall banking system is collapsing or is under a question mark, how is it that a bank like, which is not even backed by the government, it manages these astounding growth rates? So interestingly, there is a phrase for Yes Bank which is called dinner banking, what does anybody know what is dinner banking? Anybody's read about? Yeah, so Athreya, your question, yeah, this is the credit growth rate. Athreya, which slide were you asking this question? Athreya, you there?
Yeah, the same slide, sir. I got the answer, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so does anybody know what's dinner banking? So dinner banking is that you meet Rana Kapoor over a dinner in one of those fancy Mumbai dinners, and the next day you get a loan. So in phone banking, at least you got a call from the finance ministry, and there would be sweat public sector bank's office, but then gradually you'll give the loan. In Yes Bank's case, as several journalists have pointed out, that Rana Kapoor is this big flamboyant banker and wants to really grow big, is very ambitious. And all these stories are very, very similar to the stories of similar Chuck Prince and other, Lehman Brothers, I'm forgetting the name, Richard Fuld. So all these CEOs of US banks who wanted to grow big, who wanted to really grow their banks at all costs, here we see similar things with the Yes Bank. So as we were in 2008 crisis, as we were celebrating that Indian banking is doing fairly well, we don't really have any of these stories like Lehman and all that. We are seeing some very similar lifestyles and similar problems and similar behavior in the Indian banking system as well. Okay. So, but it's interesting that in 2016, financial markets had figured problems on the Yes Bank. Banks had hidden true NPA numbers. In 2019, RBI pushed Rana Kapoor out of the bank. Ravneet Gill joins as a CEO, but Rana continues to influence lending decisions. Now I'm naming all these guys because, as I'll argue, culture and all these problems have become another central topic to understanding banking today. 5th March 2020, Yes Bank is placed under a moratorium. RBI appoints an administrator. Does anybody know what a moratorium is? Does anybody know what a moratorium is?
Sir, actually, our lending
So, Jaya, you
decision.
are answering all the questions. Can we ask somebody else to answer?
Sure.
If people don't answer, we can ask you. Yeah. Nobody here. Let me. Asha. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes, so it's like a stay on paying off the debt. It's like a temporary
Right.
relief debt.
Yes, absolutely. So essentially, when I said India has a banking history, I want to relate this episode to the Indian banking history. So in 1960s, we had this major bank failure, and at that time, you had something called liquidation, which meant that the bank would simply be liquidated, and depositors would get whatever money was remaining of the assets. But that led to a big furor, and RBI then worked out this arrangement called moratorium. So something which was worked out in the 1960s continues to serve us today. So this whole evolution of banking and banking regulation and how it helps and so on and so forth is a very interesting area of research. So Yes Bank is placed under a moratorium, and as Asha and some of you said, that in this you appoint an administrator, and what you say is that basically at most you can withdraw 5,000 rupees or 10,000 rupees based on the bank's condition as a depositor. So 6th March 2020. So as RBI places a bank under a moratorium, RBI starts to find buyers. And in this case, typically in the past, whenever a bank has failed, RBI has worked out a similar scheme, but it has found one bank taking over the falling bank. Like in the case of Global Trust Bank in 2004, there was Oriental Bank of Commerce, and before that also several others. But in this case, since Yes Bank was very large and its position was very shaky, the RBI is unable to find one bank, and you find a consortium of banks with SBI as a major promoter of 49%, and other banks join in with a stake of 5%, 10%, and so on and so forth. And in this space also, the story of Yes Bank with Lehman Brothers is also interesting, because Lehman failed because it couldn't raise capital. Similarly, Yes Bank failed because it couldn't raise capital in the period when it was when in 2019. So if some of you read the Lehman Brothers cases, and hopefully some books are written on Yes Bank, you will see similar episodes. So you see that when the Yes Bank's Q3 results were released, you had NPAs which were larger than capital and reserves. There's no way the bank could run. Now we come to Lakshmi Vilas Bank quickly, and as some of you said, this is an old private sector bank, but established as community bank and continues to serve as a community bank. What is interesting about this bank is that it's controlled by a promoter director. By a promoter director, I mean that this promoter owns about 1 to 2% or 3% share in the bank, but he's a director on the board, and this promoter director runs the bank pretty much, from managing the board to giving loans to employing. Everything is run by this guy, and he holds this a very disproportionate control on the bank. So the CEO in these banks have generally are disempowered, and all these ideas came from PG&I committee report in 2014, which was established to study the governance in banks. KR Pradeep was one such promoter director in Lakshmi Vilas Bank. So he not just acted as a promoter director, but was also crucial to letting the bank go down under, because what these promoter directors do is they give loans to their preferred industry. And when you compare Yes Bank and Lakshmi Vilas Bank, you see that how quickly the NPA numbers, and Lakshmi Vilas Bank was in trouble much earlier on compared to Yes Bank, but in terms of when you compare Rana Kapoor and where Rana Kapoor was behaving with KR Pradeep, you see that in several ways Yes Bank was a new private bank with old private bank features. So this is important, because why did Yes Bank fail? Yes Bank failed because they just did not have the right policies, right things. So when we talk about banking crisis, so we need to move away from just looking at the macro picture of banking to the micro picture of banking, and understand how that actually how the bank functioned, how that bank was organized. And in this case, we see some parallels and some dissimilarities. And with Yes Bank, we see that it was a new private bank, but it had all these old private bank features, where Rana Kapoor wanted to control the bank. he had a great board and all that, but never gave those. In November 2020, similarly. But what is interesting is that RBI allowed DBS, which is a Singapore-based bank, which has a branch in India, subsidiary in India, to take over Lakshmi Vilas Bank. So this is an interesting development because so far, we only allowed the Indian banks to take over the struggling Indian banks, but we have allowed a foreign bank. So the idea here is that maybe there is a thinking that we need to open up our banking to foreign players, and I think that's largely welcome. Though there are some other reasons that the government has closer connections to the Singapore government, and that could also be a reason for pushing a Singapore-based entity to Lakshmi Vilas Bank. But DBS is a very strong bank, and LVB is a very poor and very sort of poorly financed bank, and so on and so forth. So just those ties will not work. I think DBS sees some business case taking LVB and getting that South India franchise and moving on and expanding its banking in India. So the question then is that the blame game, who is to be blamed here? We all have money in banks, our parents have money in banks, our relatives have money in banks. And the moment they find out that there is this person here who's teaching economics, or there's a student here who's studying economics, the question pops up. Arey yaar, banks mein kya ho raha hai? I mean, what's happening to our banks? Is that question asked to any of you? Does that question come to any of you? Knowing that you're studying economics, they expect you to know the answers? Yes, no? Students here? No? Okay. Lucky, because I always get these questions and I obviously don't have answers. So in this case, there is a, when we are trying to find out this picture of who murdered the Indian banking system, there are multiple murderers. So one of the major problems, like when you talk about public sector banks, there is something called a dual regulation structure. What does dual regulation structure mean? That there are dual powers between Finance Ministry and RBI. So pre-69, all the banking powers, the regulating powers were with the RBI. Post-69, Finance Ministry took away some powers of appointing because government became the major owner. So all the appointment rules and several other matters of loan decision, that went to Finance Ministry. So there was a department in Finance Ministry, the Department of Financial Services, which basically was like a parallel structure with RBI regulating public sector banks. So whenever it comes to RBI regulating public sector banks vis-a-vis government regulating public sector banks, the CEO of the public sector bank will always hear the Finance Ministry, RBI. So RBI has very little say on public sector banks compared to private banks. And similarly, we have a dual regulatory structure between state governments and RBI in cooperative banks. So these two suffer from serious governance problems, and all of these problems have been highlighted in the past, but the governments have not really allowed RBI to take full control of public sector banks. When we come to private banks, obviously here RBI has to take the blame because there are no dual powers, and whether it's the new private sector bank or the old private sector bank, RBI has full powers, and there is clearly a fault of RBI's regulation supervision. They somehow couldn't spot the problems and they allowed the problem to become very big. But then there is another sort of a thing which is not highlighted as much, that the role of bank promoters, boards, independent directors, what are they doing? And if you look at Yes Bank and you look at its board members, you'll see all the marquee names, all the former IAS officers and some very distinguished people. But I'm very surprised that all this blame of Yes Bank comes to Rana Kapoor alone and not to the independent directors. If you're an independent director, your job is to question the decisions being taken in the banks. But if you allow Rana Kapoor and others to simply ride over you, then you should simply raise those questions and resign. But we never saw anything of that sort. And unlike the West, where I think there has been some criticism of people running these banks, and we have not questioned them enough. In fact, if we do a deeper dig, we also see several RBI deputy governors and executive directors and so on and so forth acting as independent directors and so on and so forth, and not really acting. Then there have been several committees, and many of these ideas which I am referring to here, they have been discussed because even if let's say there are problems with private sector banks, but public sector banks, if there are problems, it will take the entire banking with it because it still has 60%, 65% of the stake. So the bigger problem is obviously with the public sector banks, and some of this major problem of dual regulation, this has been highlighted by several committees, including the Narasimham committee. Mr. Narasimham just passed away recently, and a very interesting career he's had. So, but none of these recommendations were implemented. The only positive so far is that there has been no major bank run. What are the reforms which have been proposed? And obviously, this is where it's work in progress. As far as public sector banks are concerned, firstly, the government, there were 21 public sector banks and 6 state SBI state banks, which were the state associate banks, State Bank of Travancore and all that. They were all merged with SBI, and then we've merged the 21 banks into 12 banks right now. Because when it would have been difficult to privatize or disinvest these banks in such a large number, so you've consolidated them. And in this budget, we announced 2 banks, but soon thereafter, we had a second wave, and all this has been postponed. So we really don't know. But obviously, this major problem of dual regulation still remains. So unless the government bites this and ends this dual regulation structure, all this is just a sideshow, because you are still going to control SBI, which controls about 15%, or which has about 15% share, 15 to 20% share. So still 20% of the banking is going to remain with you, even if you privatize all these other, struggling public sector banks. New private banks, there are tighter regulations at work. I'm happy to discuss what they are. Then old private sector banks, the promoter directors from all these banks have been removed, but there are seeding problems. These banks have a peculiar problem of governance, and so you can't do away with these governance problems in one shot. So you need there are still some things. And apart from this, though we've not discussed these things, but things like non-banking finance companies, housing finance companies, cooperative banks, there are some changes. So why we saw NBFCs going into a crisis? Because RBI didn't have adequate powers. So RBI has given more powers. Housing finance companies were regulated by National Housing Bank. Those powers have shifted to RBI. So the government still has faith in RBI, which is good. But at the same time, RBI has to instill some confidence in us as well. So, okay. Apart from this, RBI had 6 departments: regulation and supervision, 2 broad departments divided into commercial banks, NBFC, and cooperative banks. So what you had is, these silos, right? And now RBI has tried to put them all together, because though we've not discussed this in this presentation, but commercial banks, and cooperative banks, these risks are fungible. I mean, a cooperative bank, if it goes under, it creates problems for commercial banks. Likewise, NBFCs, if they go under, they create problems for commercial banks, because both of them borrow heavily from commercial banks. And likewise, if commercial banks go under, then NBFCs and cooperative banks are in a problem, because they cannot anymore borrow from. So what you need is a streamlined, and this career of regulation and supervision, at least when we were doing our studies, was not really highlighted. But I think it's a very interesting career for economic students to look at. And RBI regularly does exams and all that. And apart from just going into research, some of you could look at a career in regulation and supervision. Then there is this increased policy emphasis on improving governance. RBI has instituted chief compliance officer in all the banks, which means that whatever regulations and supervisions you do, they have to be complied with in the right time and spirit. So then RBI is trying to strengthen the tenure norm. Parallelly, the government has hiked deposit insurance to give depositors confidence in the banking system. Okay, so there is, I mean, this is a short kind of a discussion, and those of you who want to go through details of it, you have to come to Ahmedabad University, and maybe we need to have a longer chat, or you can, join us in one of our economics programs. But the idea behind this presentation was to simply give you a perspective on that, how did this banking problem come into picture, and what are the chief reasons for it. And obviously, we've not got into a lot of details given the time constraint. But now comes this pandemic, and as you see that all these efforts which were being done, you've started, and I have not highlighted IDRBT, sorry, the Indian Banking Code, which has come up, which has also led to fair bit of, because that's a separate topic by itself. So several changes and several modifications from the RBI has led to the NPAs by December 2020 come to a more respectable figure of 6.75. And then the pandemic strikes. And typically, if you look at RBI's own projections, where you look at the baseline projection, the medium stress, so severe stress. So these stress tests have become fairly important post 2008 crisis, where you expose or you shock the banking system that if it makes so much losses based on the economic impact and so on and so forth, where can the NPAs go? And if you see for public sector banks, September 20, your NPAs are hovering at about 9%, 10%. And baseline scenario also, this is just the first wave. I mean, second wave, we are still not sure. Some people are saying second wave is going to impact our economy severely. Some people are saying that second wave might not impact the economy as severely as it impacted the first wave, because we went through a full lockdown, whereas the lockdown is much more relaxed period. But 16% sort of a number, which is larger than the 14% number we had, during this sort of a surge of NPAs. So, and the shock is not just limited to public sector banks. The private sector banks are also expected to be about 8% NPAs. Foreign banks are also 5%. And overall, the banking sector is expected to come to a 14% sort of a NPA in a baseline. And if you severely expose the thing, it could go to 15%. So again, this is a very freak time. As Indian banks were recovering from the shock, the pandemic has come and it has impacted us. And unfortunately, the public sector banks, because of all these funding problems, are not as well capitalized. So the weight of the NPAs is going to weigh much more on the public sector banks compared to the private banks. This is a very uncertain phase for Indian banking, and we have to still wait and watch and see how it goes. So summing up this talk, India's recent banking crisis has become a systemic problem, where we see how it started with just public sector banks, but then you have private banks, you have cooperative banks, you have NBFCs, you have housing finance companies. All of them have some or the element of. So something has obviously gone wrong in terms of regulation and supervision, and that's the reason why we need young people like you to look at regulation and supervision much more seriously. And typically, when we were economic students, we were not really emphasized, but in Ahmedabad University, as I explained, interdisciplinary and all that, so our students do take finance courses and stuff like that. So you get a broader perspective of how these problems typically come in. And the pandemic obviously is a shock, and we have to see what final impact it's going to have. And RBI will have to sharpen its regulatory and supervision functions even more. In fact, the next failures could be fintechs, seeing the number of, there was a Union Swiss report recently which talked about 100 unicorns, and most of those unicorns are apparently in financial sector doing fintech work. And I just don't understand that if they don't really have the kind of business, then can they really generate such high valuation? So we could see the next round of failures in fintechs. And I think if we go back to Schumpeter creative destruction kind of a thing, then it's natural that such innovations lead to some shocks, some closures, and then gradually it declines. But as I said, for financial sector, these things become more complicated given the interlinkages. Hyman Minsky's work has become more important in understanding banking crisis, and I request some of you to at least go back to and reading Hyman Minsky, who's a forgotten economist, but it's his work which helps us understand much of the banking problems. But there are some other schools of thought as well. There is an Austrian school which completely will disagree with what Hyman has to say. Then there is Friedman Bernanke school of Great Depression of banking, and then you have balance of payments driven banking troubles and so on. So typically when you run fixed exchange rate systems and so on and so forth, then and if those exchange rates devalues sharply and you have liabilities, and so finally there's this quote from Narasimhan Committee report, which maybe I'll just put it at the end. That basically what Narasimhan is, so this report is written in 1991, and what Narasimhan is saying is that despite the progress in the Indian banking system, our banking continues to be a big problem. So what is interesting is that this quote written in 1991 continues to apply to our banking. So how much of it is still a work in progress? And that's the reason why we need young people to look at banking, look at regulation, look at supervision as a serious career. Okay, so summer do it yourself projects. There are fair bit of projects students here logged in can do. You have a lot of data on RBI's website. You can do a detailed bank group-wise or bank-wise analysis, history of Indian banking and regulation, governance and culture in banking, which has become a very important topic. You're seeing is that that there are certain governance and cultural norms which have been discarded, like whether you look at Yes Bank or whether you look at Lehman Brothers and whether you look at some of those Irish banks and stuff like that. So there is a much global picture at play that banking, which was meant to serve people, is only serving one's own pockets. And that's becoming a big problem of late. Then obviously there's this whole review of macroeconomics and finance banking linkages, and especially economic students who are not who've not studied banking so far or finance so far should definitely look at these interlinkages, and you could look at a summer project on these things. By the way, I can, if you want some help, I can help, but I can't really I don't have any internship or anything. So, but I'm happy to talk to you, and if you have some problem, then you want to work on any of these things. And there's this whole banking post-2008 pandemic, technology in banking finance, cryptocurrencies, climate change. It's fascinating how much climate change, how many central bank financial institutions are looking at climate change as a potential risk to the balance sheet, and they're trying to encourage green lending and so on and so forth. And then something like micro and macro prudential regulations. Okay, so thanks for your time, and I'm open to questions and discussion. And as I close, we have upcoming webinars with Puneet Arora next week, and with Professor Pallavi, we'll send you the dates. So we hope that we can continue this conversation going ahead. Thank you.
Sir, I want to ask you
Thank
that,
you.
first of all, thanks for covering the entire banking aspects in today's time. But so what is the scenario globally over while we are comparing with India, like US or maybe European countries, where we are standing with respect to the how next couple of years, 2-3 years of time? What's your take?
No, globally also, see everywhere, what do we mean by when we look at American banks or when we look at European banks? So typically for all of them, the 2008 crisis was a work in progress. They had all started raising capital. They are much better capitalized, and as a result, they've been able to handle the pandemic much better. But again, the pandemic has created such a fog with so many lockdowns, and so unless we get some clarity on the pandemic picture going forward, it's very difficult to give a call on banking right now. What RBI and all the regulators are doing are pretty much firefighting stage. Nobody's really looking at some sort of a long-term scenario saying that, okay, what is it going to look like? Right now, it is basically making sure that so since the pandemic last year, something like $10 trillion have been pumped in the economy globally, basically to make sure that the banking system is floating. And banks don't mind the criticism that you're trying to save them, you're trying to safeguard them, because right now, if central banks withdraw that liquidity, then the banks can withdraw from the government securities, and then there's a further problem. So there are many interlinkages at work here, and all these interlinkages are suffering from serious fog because of the pandemic. So unless we get some clarity, so if I was making this presentation in let's say February and March, I would be giving you a much more optimistic scenario, because we didn't really see a second wave in India at that time. Everybody is expecting a broader recovery. But right now, it is completely, all I can say is that it'll be a slow grind from here on. Once these pandemic fears are over, the regulators have to again group together and again capitalize these banks, and again look at the kind of losses you're going to make. The lockdowns and some sectors have suffered. So something like airline loans and tourism. So all these sectors on which heavy loans have been given, they'll be going through a slow grind. So which banks have exposure to these kinds of loans? What kind of moratorium, what kind of schemes have been there? And as soon as you rewind these schemes, what is going to be the kind of an impact? So it's a very difficult time really for banks and for me to really give an answer. All I can say is that we started this process, and obviously the globally this process started in 2008. So by the time the pandemic came, they were in a much better position compared to India, where we just had about 4 or 5 years. 2015 is where the problem started, and since then it's been a slow grind, and you started recovering, and then this pandemic has come in and is impacting our banking system severely. So the lesson from all this is that each time your banks are under some kind of a trouble and you come through a banking crisis, you've got to resolve it quickly. We had several opportunities to do it, but we sat on it, and as a result, maybe our Indian banking system, which was the highlight during the 2008 crisis, is going to be one of the worst affected post the pandemic. Chintan, have I
Yeah.
confused you, or
No,
have
no,
I-
no. I have get the clarity about it.
Okay.
But overall, when I see this is a cultural and a system problem more than a money problem. Because for example, I'm just taking an example. One of my very close friend who is passed out with me has joined the Yes Bank in 2014 as a manager.
Right.
Then he has worked there and reached to a vice president position in 2020.
Ah.
And all these blunder and happen, and now now he has shifted and he is the vice president Kotak Mahindra Bank.
Right.
So the people who are not working for the real growth, who are pumping the forced growth in the
Right.
system,
Right.
are gradually that growth which is being created is being collapsed, and that is creating a long-term problem in the overall system in the long run.
Yeah, fair enough. In fact, some of you can build a career here in terms of identifying people who've had a poor track record and just end up joining a higher position. And there are several people on Twitter who do that. There are all these guys who point out that how this appointment was happened despite such a poor record. So as I said, that we need a collective movement here to clean up certain things. And that's the reason why the call to students to join these places and work with ethics and principles in mind. A couple of years back, nobody questioned culture and governance, but it's becoming a systemic problem, and there is no doubt about that.
Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else has a question about our university or our program or the topic?
Just a question about the program.
Right.
For working professionals, do you offer the MA Economics or a PhD course?
So as far as MA Economics is concerned, it's a full-time program, so we don't really have an option. And Ahmedabad University, it's fairly rigorous. So our classes are from 8 to 8. So we don't really entertain. We can't really entertain working professionals who want to do this as a part-time thing. Even in a PhD, you can check with Professor Bijal Mehta or some others who are. I think we have Ekta here who's in the PhD office. And even there, we have a coursework which is again compulsory and full-time. So not sure whether you can manage it that way.
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
Can
Can you introduce yourself, Akash? Mudit, could you tell us where you're from?
Hi, Mudit. I work as a risk analyst in Deutsche Bank, Pune.
Okay. Pune. Okay.
This is
maybe you should-
Akash and I'm a current AU student at the
Okay.
university.
Okay.
So
You are
I'd
a
like to
student
know
in
about.
doing an MBA?
No. I'm pursuing BBA honors.
Okay.
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 So I'd like to know what do you think about the future of banking? Like now cryptocurrencies are taking over all the payments method and it's really popular right now. And
Right.
also like it gives us all the freedom to decentralize and non-tracking, no regulations and all. So where does banking stand after 10 to 15 years?
No, I think this whole banking thing is going to go through a massive transformation. And the pandemic has obviously quickened the pace of transformation by what could have happened in 2025 or something. It has happened in 2020, 21. The whole digitization space, emergence of artificial. So Ravi, your question is obviously important. At the same time, we are just a 2-year, 2 to 3-year-old program, and any time goes through its challenges. Our major batch is just going to come out, and most of them are busy with their dissertations. So unless they graduate, we ourselves don't know how the placements are going to look like. But then, as I said, these are building blocks of a new university, a young university. We are making all the right efforts, and if we get the right kind of students, I'm sure we can, break this placement barrier too. Any new student, there are these initial struggles with placements and so on and so forth. But as far as my understanding goes, if you do our program properly, you are ready to compete in the markets. Economics, an economic specialization, a super specialization sort of a thing. And anybody who comes here, generally the expectation is that that student is well versed with research and so on and so forth. And as long as you can demonstrate your capabilities outside, you will get a job. I don't really have a problem with that. The question really is whether whether you can commit yourself fully to the program and all these skills which are required for an MA program. Ravi, did I answer your question somewhat, or is there anybody, my colleagues here, who want to add to this? Supratim, do you want to add to this, or Professor Jimol, if she's around?
So Amol, yeah, I mean, what do you want me to add?
No, as in your experiences with
just one second. Just 1 second. Yeah, excuse me. You can ask someone else. Just one.
Okay, so yeah, Ravi, if this is a challenge with all the new universities, I think we have to struggle with it. All the today's IIMs, their all initial batches went through fair bit of trouble. It's only post actualization 1991 that they started getting jobs, to be honest. So we are at least much better off. We are hopeful that with the kind of program, the kind of teaching we have, once we are few years older and all that, I'm sure our placements and all of that would be fairly good as well. Yeah, okay. So yeah, Mudit, thanks for the climate change. I've already discussed that and the BIS paper on collateral. So maybe Mudit, you can link that paper here so for others to read or whatever. Anybody else has any question?
Amol, yes, I'm back. I'm sorry, there was somebody at the door, so I had to.
That's okay. I think we are all grappling with these problems. So for a long time now.
Yeah. What was?
No, what I was saying is that in case you want to discuss your experiences of doing an MA and.
Yeah. So basically, yeah. So first of all, yeah, I was trying to send a message to this Akash Jain, but he has left, I think. Yeah, he's my student Mitra for the Circle of Care. So I hope he joins the MA program. So students, yeah, I mean, MA, I did my MA many years ago. So as Amol said, we are all kind of older generation or in the transition. So it was not interdisciplinary as we are trying here at Ahmedabad University. So it is definitely much valued. And I would second what Professor Amol said about bolstering the courses, right? I think we should really, push that we have really designed courses which are at the intersection of artificial intelligence, machine learning, as well as economics and finance. I think so students, we are also having an emphasis on economics, general economics, MA, and we'll also have an emphasis on economics and finance. So you can send email to Professor Amol, or you can look up in the website Professor Vinod Madhavan. He will teach the finance related courses. So that is an interesting possibility at the at the intersection of economics and finance, and some financial economics as well. So I hope that interests you. And I teach energy. So I teach economics with emphasis on energy. So I will teach a course that will be offered to you in the second year. And one thing I want to add, if Amol permits me, should we tell them about the thesis or non-thesis option, or?
Yeah, maybe I think we are already running out of time.
Yeah,
so
for a later time.
Yeah, in the next week, those of you who want to join us again.
So basically, students, this was to kind of, hopefully to to get your interest in the program and at the university. I mean, we have a great pool of faculty. I mean, all of them are here. I mean, most of us are here today. So, yeah. So thank you, students.
So does anybody have a question or any final comment? Any topics we could look at in future in case, apart from looking at our own programs and so on and so forth, we are genuinely, interested to just have a chat and so on and so forth. But in case we can be of, yeah.
I think a follow-up webinar on the interlinkages between the NBFC and cooperative banks and how they have evolved would be, from my point of view.
Okay. Sure. So obviously, if I take up all the finance space, my colleagues are going to be unhappy. So we'll be discussing experimental economics next week, which is going to be very interesting. And you can do these experiments in the financial services industry as well. And Puneet telling us how experiments work in education. And then we'll see. So thanks, Mudit. We'll see what we can do about this going forward. Okay, so can we call it a close, Samir?
Yes, Professor, sure.
Okay,
I believe
thank
more
you.
the
Thank you so
question
much.
and answer are done.
Thanks all for joining us.
Thank you.
Just pass on the word if you can, and we can. Even if you don't really want to join Ahmedabad University, but let's say you have some queries on economics and so on and so forth, at least on banking and stuff, I'm more than happy to chat over LinkedIn and social media and so on and so forth. Right? Thank you.